Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Eric Raus of Liberty University, and today we are going to discuss leading contemporary virtual organizations. As part of today's discussion, we'll define the difference between distributedness and virtuality, while looking at frameworks for putting together a virtual team. We'll explore the idea of virtual intelligence, along with ways of developing trust within your virtual organization. Next, we'll look at some different virtual leadership styles, focusing in on transactional and transformational, along with authentic and servant leadership. Next, we'll look at the impact of media richness on virtual leadership and virtual trust and other actions. After that, we'll explore some team virtual leadership preferences with a test that is available for your organization to look at how best to fit a manager or leader with the rest of the group. After that, we'll look at how virtual leaders have certain competencies and finding those competencies within your leadership team. And finally, we'll take it all together and explore the idea of virtual organizations through a biblical worldview. Of course, at the very end, please see the list of references that we'll use throughout this production. It would be difficult to have a discussion about virtual organizations and virtuality without defining what is the difference between distributedness and virtuality. Over the last 20 to 30 years, we've used all sorts of terms to describe working at a different location than others and using technology to talk back and forth. So what is the difference? Well, I tend to go with Chen, Henry, and Pentelli's definitions of distributedness and virtuality. Distributedness really focuses on where you're working compared to others inside of your organization. If you're working in separate locations without much physical face-to-face engagement with each other for a preponderance of the time, that is a distributed situation. On the other hand, when we look at virtuality, we're exploring how you're interacting with other members of your team. Are you using information communication technologies to accomplish interdependent work? So working together through the use of technology? Well, in that case, now we're speaking about virtuality. So what is a contemporary virtual organization? Is it distributed? Is it virtual? Well, let's take a look. Perhaps it's both. Given that distributedness has to do with where you're working and virtuality, how you're working with your team members, it can be very argued that distributedness and virtuality are not a dichotomy, but instead there are levels of each as an independent factor. In that way, you can have an organization that is both low distributedness and low virtuality. That would be your traditional organization, your traditional business, where everyone works generally in the same location and they work mostly face-to-face. There are some who can occasionally telework and work through means there. You may have an occasional VTC or virtual teleconference in which you use information and communication technology to coordinate, but for the most part, you're working in a traditional organization. At the same time, you could have an organization that has low distributedness, but high virtuality. Perhaps only a few people work in a different location, but they extensively use technology to coordinate and communicate for interdependent work between the two groups, those that are in the building and those that are at other locations. You could also have an organization that is high distributed but low virtuality. And in this case, I think of many of our teleworkers and others who did work in separate locations prior to having such rich technology that we have today. When you worked independently at different locations, but then had to come together to put all of the work together, to do that interdependent coordination and cooperation at some point. And finally, generally what we're speaking about today in a contemporary virtual organization is one with high distributedness and with high virtuality. In this case, people are located at all corners of the globe, but they're communicating and keeping together and working together on a daily basis through the use of information technology. That is the different variations that you have and the different frameworks through which virtual and distributed teams can be formed. Regardless of whether your organization is distributed or virtual or a combination of the two, leaders require intelligence to be able to lead, guide, and understand the members that are working as part of their team. I've coined the term virtual intelligence, which is a combination of emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence, but in the unique situations that virtuality and virtual organization puts us in. Emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive, assess, and express emotions, assess and generate feelings, and to self-regulate your own emotions in order to allow for growth. On the other hand, cultural intelligence is the ability to perceive and assess the impact of team members' cultural differences and how those differences between different members of your organization can cause trust or other friction points. Well, with virtual intelligence, we're using both our emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence combined together, but we're having to assess these things with very limited face-to-face communications. Oftentimes, with the loss of verbal cues when we have our written communications and of nonverbal cues in non-video situations. And so in those cases, we're having to evaluate how someone's emotions are being affected by what's being said without being able to see those nonverbal clues that may be there. So it's very important to understand both the cultural and the emotional impacts that can occur from operating in a distributed and a virtual environment. One of the big areas there, and we've already started to hit on it, is the effects on virtual trust and developing virtual trust through the use of virtual intelligence. Studies from around the globe and through multiple different time periods have demonstrated how important trust is to the success of a team. Yet, in a virtual environment, it can be very difficult to generate that virtual trust. Between the lack of interpersonal communications, the lack of face-to-face engagement, and the absence of informal relationships that we have in normal traditional settings or with our friends and neighbors around the community, it can be very hard to generate true trust, which allows for unbridled communication, exchange of ideas, and for the successful coordination of different activities. How can a team accomplish things if you can't trust that the person who's going to be responsible for something else is going to actually accomplish that? And how do we work together as a team if you don't trust that the person has your best interests in mind along with that of the organization? So why is trust so important? Well, there are many factors that focus in on trust. Job satisfaction comes from trust. If you don't trust the other people that you're working with, how satisfied are you going to be in the job that you're doing? Why would you go and continue to engage with people day in and day out that you don't trust are interested in your well-being and the betterment of you as an individual and the organization overall. It can also affect productivity. In some cases, if you don't trust that someone is going to get work done, then you end up overworking, which prevents productivity and prevents multiple things from getting done because everyone is doing the same thing at the same time because no one trusts the other person to get things accomplished. Between those two factors alone, the personal well-being can be affected because of that lack of trust. Self-doubt, questioning the relationships that you have with others, all of these things, overwork, all of these things can have a negative impact on the personal well-being of the individuals inside of your team. Because of this, it's extremely important to find different methods of developing virtual trust. In the post-COVID time period, many of the recommendations that have come out include the idea of engaging in having a water cooler area for your teammates to be able to informally talk together and start to build those relationships that they normally would at the office. Additionally, there are recommendations to have social gatherings in the virtual realm, more casual ones, such as we call them hail and farewells in the military, but the welcoming of new members onto the team in a festive party-like atmosphere, a dinner party type of an idea. Part of what plays a role in this are the virtual leadership styles that managers use and how they affect trust, along with other factors within the virtual community. And we'll cover those on the next slide. Virtual leadership styles are no different than traditional leadership styles. They just operate inside the bubble of the virtual umbrella. We're going to talk about two major types of leadership styles: contemporary leadership and contingent reward leadership styles. Under the contemporary leadership style, we look at authentic and servant leadership. We call them contemporary because they have had a lot of research very recently. Authentic leadership really came into its fold within the last 20 years, whereas servant leadership, it goes back much further, but has had a resurgence in its research and focus. Authentic leadership focuses on an interpersonal perspective, an intrapersonal perspective, and a developmental perspective. The authentic leader is authentic to themselves. They understand their level of knowledge, they know how well they can self-regulate, and they have a good idea of their self-concept. When working with others, they're authentic to those people. They let them see who they are, and they let them understand how they feel in different situations with their followers. But they're also authentic in that they develop into leaders based on the positive psychological qualities and the strong ethics that are a part of them. They continue to develop naturally and authentically from being that follower to being that leader and remembering the way that they made it up to that leadership position. When we look at servant leaders, their focus and their point of view is really what makes the difference. A servant leader wants to serve first, and then they make a conscious effort that the best way for them to serve is through leading. But that service always comes first, and you see that in servant leaders through their guiding, their mentoring, and their nurturing of those around them, and seeking always for the improvement of the individuals that work for them and even whom they work for through that mindset of service first. Now let's move over to the contingent reward. This for that, quid pro quo. We can use that in a negative way or a positive. The transactional leader very much a quid pro quo when you take everything else away from it. It's the idea of changing something of value to the follower for something that the leader values. And their influence comes from the fact that what's in the best interest of the follower is to do what's in the best interest of the leader. There's very little focus on the individual that's the follower, and most of the focus is on getting things done and being productive. When we look at a transformational leader, there's many of the transactional attributes that are there. They're still focused on getting things done and exchanging something of value for the accomplishment. But they also look at the individual needs of their followers and look to develop their followers because they see that improving their follower helps to improve them and gets better productivity. They provide strong role models for their followers with a developed set of moral values and self-determination sense that allows others to see that they have a say in where they move. Because of that, they allow followers with opposing viewpoints to express their ideas, and they accept those different ideas and at least give them a hearing. But they also provide their followers with a map of the way ahead, at least how they see it, for the organization. And make it clear that part of that involves very specific values and norms that they expect from the organization as a whole and from the individuals within that organization. So now we've talked about these two major types and four different subsets of leadership styles. But how do they work in a contemporary virtual organization? Recent research into leadership styles show that authentic and servant leadership, those that we're calling the contemporary styles, are beneficial when there is low media virtuality, when the virtual organization is newly formed and people are going through uncertain personal and professional situations. As to why, that's a good question. But what it seems to be from the research is that authentic leaders place their followers first. They're looking and being authentic to them, which helps to build trust. And with the servant leadership, the focus is on serving. And this helps to build and maintain trust through that openness and through that selfless service. Coming out of the initial lockdowns, or going into, as it would be, the initial lockdowns of the COVID pandemic, is when we saw authentic and servant leadership as being some of the most successful leadership methods for those who had been in traditional organizations and had to go virtual, because they were able to build that trust and let their followers know things were going to be okay, they were going to be taken care of, and they were going to provide them with the honest truth as to what the current situation was. Now, let's take a look at the contingent reward styles and where those have shown to be beneficial. As one might expect from our discussion on the authentic and servant leadership styles and when they were beneficial, transactional and transformational are the opposite scenarios. They tended to be the best leadership styles when there's a very media-rich environment where we're doing a lot of actions and interactions in that virtual world. Also, organizations that already were established as virtual organizations, because that didn't present as part of the personal and professional change that those who were more accepting of the servant and authentic leadership areas needed to build that trust. That trust is already there in these organizations, and so there's not that extra need. So why is that? Well, leadership styles of the transformational and transactional are results focused. They're looking to get things done, and so they tend to be more successful organizations when the trust aspects and the uncertainty isn't a factor. Additionally, with a rich virtual environment, it allows that transformational leader's charismatic approach to shine through. You're seeing, you're hearing, you're feeling the energy and the thoughts and the ideas of that transformational leader. Additionally, both transactional and transformational focuses and styles focus on empowering others and decentralizing away from themselves. This allows for that distributedness and virtuality to work together to make a successful organization. So, as we see, there is a difference between these two styles, these two major groupings. Some are beneficial in certain situations, and some are in others. We've also started to discuss this idea of media richness. So let's explore that a little further. Media richness refers to the use of technology to provide instant feedback through verbal and nonverbal signals that you're receiving from the other side of the screen. And that allows for the personalization of those messages, and that builds the sense of individual communication and togetherness into your communications and your leadership aspects. As a result, the use of rich media technology can allow for increased trust and improved collaboration within a team. Its effects are most markedly seen in transactional and transformational leadership styles because of the ability to reach out and show what's happening, to be able to use those charismatic aspects that are part of that transformational leader, along with being able to understand the quid pro quo that's going on, to be able to cut through some of the noise that can happen from a written sense in transactional styles. That being said, there is an importance to understand what is the preference of your team when deciding how to lead and what type of leaders you're looking for. So let's explore some methods that you can use to gauge your team's preference in leadership styles amongst their leaders and managers. Just last year, a study was produced that the researchers had developed the Global Virtual Team Leadership Scale, the GVTLS. The idea of this 29-item Likert-Lite scale 5-point assessment is that it allows and assists in determining your virtual team's preference in management approaches, leadership attributes, project assignment systems, and oversight methodology. The concept here is that if we find out how our team prefers to be led, we can select the right leaders to move into those roles, as opposed to just selecting who we perceive as the best leader, but one who may have different attributes that aren't going to be readily accepted by the team that they're going to follow. This allows for us to have both bottom-up and top-down influences on how a team operates, and provides, again, for that individual nature that virtual teams are noted by. Because of those individualistic ideas and other competencies and actions that we see amongst the members of virtual teams, it requires leaders to have some specific competencies as well. The leaders in these organizations need to be able to be effective communicators across multiple media. It's not good enough that you can speak well to those around you, because you also have to type. And typing and writing and the written word can't be the only thing, because you also have to speak and have direct communications. And so using this multimedia aspect and being competent and effective at it is extremely important. as we discussed earlier, the ability to use cultural and emotional intelligence and to generate organizational trust and cohesion is extremely important. Additionally, since sometimes you can communicate quite often and other times not as much, media does go down, the internet sometimes fails, you have to be able to provide task clarity to what's happening and what you're expecting to happen around and during the time period in between your meetings. And finally, that leader has to show the ability to be reliable. There's nothing worse than being part of a team and having your leader who you're not quite sure if they're going to be there when they say they're going to be there. And at the same time, at the organizational level, you're expecting the leader to be there and to be able to deliver regardless of the type of media situation that they may be in. Ultimately, this makes the transformational leader, in general, one of the best leadership styles for the most current idea of a virtual organization. And yet, with the charismatic power that a transformational leader has, we have to make sure that we continue to operate in a biblical worldview. Now, regardless of what type of a leadership style, or even if you're just a follower, there's research that has shown how much of a difference people can act, a different way that people can act when they're in the virtual world. And because of that, it's a good idea for us to look back into the Bible and see how we're told to act regardless of what type of a world we're in. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans 12:2, talks about not conforming to this world, but to be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. He's calling us to remain true to Christ and to walk in a Christ-like way, regardless of the environment that we're in. In Ephesians 4:15, St. Paul tells us to communicate truth with love. So often in the virtual world, we're more than happy to strike out and act in ways to people that we would never do if we were face to face. We lose the love that we're supposed to have for our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. It's important for us to remember that we are all in this world together. We are all made in the image of God. With that in mind, we can look at St. James. Jesus' half-brother in James 1:19 tells us that, "Dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." It's easy to put the worst face on problems when we're in that virtual world, to think the worst of others, especially when they're not communicating truth with love to you. That's why it's important that we listen. Listen to what others are saying, what they're trying to get across from us. Take that moment, even if you're angry, especially if you're angry, to understand the impacts of it, to use that emotional and cultural intelligence, that virtual intelligence, to continue forward and to remain part of God's community. And finally, as a parting note, reverting back to St. Paul in his letter to the Galatians, 5:14, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one commandment: love your neighbor as yourself." If we remember that one rule, we can continue to walk, be it in the regular community, the traditional world, or the virtual world, in the pathway of Christ and with a biblical worldview. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for this afternoon's discussion as we talked about leading contemporary virtual organizations. Over the last 30 minutes, we've talked about the difference between distributedness and virtuality, about different frameworks for building virtual teams and balancing the different levels of distributedness and virtuality. We've discussed the idea of virtual intelligence and developing virtual trust in your organizations, how to use effective leadership styles and the impact of rich media on those styles and which is the best and which performs the best in different situations. We've identified a test, an instrument that is available to determine the virtual leadership principles and preferences of your virtual teams, along with effective competencies for leaders of virtual organizations. Finally, we brought it back to looking at where we came, from the Bible, from God's way, and looked at aspects of how to maintain that biblical worldview and biblical actions even when operating in a virtual organization. I thank you for your time today, and I hope that you will look at the slides that come up on the references that come up on the next slide to provide you with more in-depth information on the topics covered. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon. God bless.